we all want to live conscious lives. We all want to make better decisions than bad decisions. And so I think for those people that are thinking about that as it relates to apparel, it's a good one because the apparel industry is really bad. It's got tons and tons of waste attached to it and lots of inconsistent adherence to standards that are probably worth talking about if you care about it. We obviously at American Giant care about that a lot. We think it's a really, really big problem in the industry as a whole. So you mentioned some statistics. So let me give a little bit of history to it. So about 40 years ago, around 1980, something like 95% or more of the clothing that Americans purchased were made in the U.S. And that meant a very robust textile and apparel industry in the United States. And the nice thing about that, like a lot of lower skilled jobs, is they provide really important glue to communities, urban communities and rural communities. And those are communities that often need them for people that maybe don't go on to have college or graduate degrees, but want to have good, reliable jobs for their families. They provided a very large employment base for people that were coming out of high school or with trade degrees or wanted to work in the trades, to have good, viable, long-term jobs. At about that time, we began to create trade deals internationally, NAFTA being one, that began to open up trade with Central and South America and Asia that were essentially the concept was quite straightforward, which is we will be able to access cheaper labor and lower regulations, and that'll translate into more choice for the American consumer at cheaper prices. That is all true. That all is exactly what bore out. There was another target there too, which was a belief that as we began to trade with China in particular, that trading relationship over time would have a moderating effect on China. It would bring China into the first world. And China would become a world player in the first world and share of value systems and become a force for good in the world. What happened was two things. I think on the consumer side of things, that prediction bore out. What wasn't really thought about was when you do that and you evaporate all the jobs that went along with an increasing posture towards free trade. That had a tremendous hollowing out effect on communities, rural and urban communities. And when those jobs go away and they're replaced with social programs or joblessness or a combination of those things, bad things fill in. I mean, you really have, if you care about inner cities or you care about rural America, it's the same problem. But you've got narcotics moving in, you've got people that aren't working, you've got particularly young men that aren't working. And that becomes a really difficult challenge that is measured by, isn't maybe solved by having central air conditioning or a flat screen TV. That if you've got a bunch of people that aren't working and that are living in communities that are decaying, that translates into a lot of hopelessness. And I think you see that in, you look at the trend lines in the United States, they're discouraging. Young men aren't working. There's increasing levels of addiction and suicide and depression rates. And I personally tether a lot of that back to not doing a good job as a country to provide good entry-level jobs to people that need them and that want them. Mm-hmm. So that's one big piece. And the other big miscalculation in my mind is that China today is a much more intractable foe than it was 40 years ago. A much richer country today, arguably is more competitive from manufacturing and military standpoint than we are. I view it as kind of a massive wealth transfer, and that we've just made a really bad foreign policy decision. And so I think our job as business leaders is to provide alternatives to customers. I don't think it's enough to ask customers sort of in a finger wagging manner to say, you need to do better, you need to have better choices. I think we all collectively, I think policymakers need to play a role. Us business leaders need to provide good, viable alternatives to customers. And I think that they too have to sort of be mindful of, in this particular area of my life, wherever that might be, I'm going to vote with my values. And that could be, as we discussed, it could be in food, it could be on vacations, it could be on the car you drive, the clothes, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. But give consumers the choice where they can make informed decisions in maybe a better way. The final thing, I'll just end on a couple of statistics that you mentioned on this that you might find interesting. So in 1980, the average American family spent about $1,600 in today's dollars on clothes and shoes. And that represented about 65 items. Today, the average American family spends almost the same, about $1,600 on clothes and shoes, but it represents about 180 items. So there's been a fundamental shift in that category towards cheaper items, much more items and cheaper items. And I think we all intuitively get that. It's like, yeah, it's true. My parents, or when I was very young, we had fewer, better quality things. Great flannel shirts, great sweatshirts, great jeans that lasted for a long time. Yeah. And now I buy a pair of jeans and they seem to fall apart within 6 months, and my shoes don't last, and my flannel shirt's junky. And then the other thing to sort of end on a discouraging note, the average American family throws away about 80 pounds of clothing a year. So it really is this disposable stuff. Now, again,
that's
I don't want to.
Insane. I mean, if you think about 80 pounds,
it's a little crazy. It's a little crazy. I think now, to avoid the finger wagging part of it, I think I'm not sure that consumers have been given a great choice. And so, as you mentioned earlier on, we want to make really good quality stuff that's going to last, stuff that you don't have to replace. Make it in a way that you can feel really good, feel like you're contributing to helping out neighbors and communities that need jobs. And then put it out there for consumers to decide, does that make sense to me or not? And I think, I hope that we're going to see that everywhere. You're certainly doing that in food. And I think providing consumers with good choices is a great way, I think, to take a step in the right direction. Because at least in apparel, there have been very few brands that have done that well over the last 30 years or so. So tough for consumers to make good decisions there, I think, oftentimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's kind of fascinating with the just in terms of what classifies as a family, like with us and 3 boys, Quinn gets something new, or honestly, when he was little, we really couldn't, both of us were, starting Quinn, we didn't really have a salary. So we'd go to the second hand stores and get Quinn clothes. Right. Yeah. And then Quinn would outgrow them. And then Nash would wear them. And then by the time Cole got them, 5 kids had already worn them because we got them used, right? So it's kind of fascinating. Whereas if you only have one child in the household, that obviously there's nowhere to go from there, right? So you're donating them or you're giving them away. But it is there's something, and I think a company is trying to solve for that. Actually, I can't remember the name. I heard about it a couple years ago.
Well, isn't it interesting when you in that example, because I can relate too. I've got 3 young kids too. Is that when you get a good pair of pajamas or a good sweatshirt or whatever it might be, and it does make that journey, and it's great. By the time Rosie gets it, she's like, I love this sweatshirt. It's soft. Versus the things you buy that are not well made, that don't even make it for a school year, right?
Exactly.
It's really, it's really interesting. Yeah,
it's fascinating. Really even now I find myself going to, we have this amazing secondhand store in Boulder, and anytime I have to go get something, if I have to go dress up for an event, or because I clearly don't get out much, but when I do, I don't really like spending, something on a cheaper item, like poorly made, right? Yeah. I'd rather go somewhere to like the secondhand store and spend a little bit more money on something that has a little bit more quality to it, right? It doesn't really matter. Yeah. But the idea is fascinating.
And isn't it also interesting? General. And isn't it also interesting when you go into these places and you find a shirt in a secondhand store, or a jacket or a pair of pants or a dress, and you hold it, and even though you may know nothing about apparel, you know right away that, oh yeah, this is nice. This is a nice 100%. Thing. There's just this feel to it that you can see the craft and the material choices that is just demonstrable. It's so neat to see when you find those gems in secondhand stores. I think I'm particularly drawn to things like apparel. Flannel, where you find a beautiful old flannel, a beautiful old yarn-dyed flannel. It's just such a magical thing when you find that. It's almost like a completely different species of clothing when you find the ones that were made in the 70s and the 80s and the 60s. They're just beautiful.
They're beautiful. I have the same affinity for flannel, by the way. I'm excited about your new flannel.
Oh, we are too. That I'll tell you, boy, you want to talk about some of the challenges about making stuff domestically. That flannel experience has been...
let's talk about it, because I think, you have chosen one of the hardest paths, right? I think in fashion and apparel right now. So yeah, let's jump in. What has been the struggles tied to, especially making flannel in the United States?
Yeah, I would say the narrative is choosing the toughest path, and there's a lot of truth to that. There's been lots and lots of challenges. We can talk about any of them, but there's also a flip side to it. It's been very rewarding, and in some ways a lot easier. We avoided up from all the supply chain disaster that's gone on for the last couple of years. We avoided that almost entirely. So there's been a lot of benefits, and I think the relationships we built over time, it's really fascinating that there's almost a familial quality with all of our suppliers now, that I know them all very, very well. I've known them for a long time. And so there are some things about doing it domestically and close by where there are tremendous benefits in terms of quality, in terms of intimacy and relationships and responsiveness that have been much easier than trying to make stuff, time zones and borders and oceans away. But I think as a general matter, as I said earlier, I think there's been this over the last 40 years, there's been this massive shift in trade policy. And textiles is one, and I think there's elements that are also true with ag. Textiles is one that is very easy to offshore because textiles, apparel production are very high in labor. They're expensive, and we pay people in the United States a lot more than they pay people in places like Bangladesh, for example, or China. And so textiles were one of the first things to offshore. They went very quickly overseas, and they're also easy to. You can stand up a textile factory much easier than you can a silicon chip factory, right? You just put in some sewing machines, and in many, many countries, people know how to sew. So very quick to offshore. And the result was that the cut and sew industry, and then also the yarning and the knitting and the weaving and the dyeing industries that supported the textile industry, by and large, have idled for the last 30 or 40 years. So many of the businesses that have survived have not continued to invest in automation and technology to stay up with the times. A lot of that is that many of these are family businesses that they're not sitting on $200,000 or $500,000 of cash to go upgrade machinery or to train their people and keep them current. Most of that capital and capability went overseas also. So as we got into it, there are real exceptions to that, by the way. There are companies domestically that have been bold and stayed in front of the training and the innovation and the automation curves. But by and large, you find lots of family businesses that are deep in talent and craft and understanding, but typically the machinery is older, is more outdated. So in different instances, t-shirt production, sweatshirt production was very easy to get that going. There's a ton of knitwear capability still in the U.S. But flannel, yarn-dyed flannel in particular, had gone. Yarn-dyed flannel left the United States in the mid 80s, basically, and went to
completely everything.
Completely. Okay. And the thing about yarn-dyed flannel, just to get kind of geek out with you for a second, is that when you have a shirt, a woven shirt, like a flannel shirt, that's comprised of lots and lots and lots of individual strands of yarn. Yarn dyed is what it implies. Each of those individual strands of yarn are dyed. That provides all the beautiful texture and color that you think of when you think of your dad's flannel shirt that was in the closet for 30 years. And a lot of the kind of hand feel that you've gotten used to, but that requires a lot of art and a lot of manual labor to dye those individual yarns. And I was really interested in reclaiming that. Everybody was telling me it's not possible. In fact, when I started the company, I either wanted to do a blue jean, a sweatshirt, a t-shirt, or a flannel. I ended up doing the sweatshirt as our initial product because it was easy. Flannel was far too difficult, but I've been really interested in trying to reclaim a yarn-dyed flannel. And as I poked at that for a long time, I kept hearing from people, can't do it. Eventually, I spoke to a guy named James McKinnon, who runs Cotswold, which is a relatively large textile producer in the United States, and is a friend of ours. And James says, maybe we should look at both automotive and some of the stuff that's happening in fire suits, which is kept domestic. And there was a producer that was doing some fire suit stuff, that was doing some yarn dyeing. And little by little, we assembled a supply chain that we were able to, starting in 2018, we launched our first line of flannel. That was the one that was covered in the New York Times, that big, long article about that. And each year, we've continued to make flannel, but each year, some piece of that supply chain has gotten wobbly. We've had to replace. So this year is no exception. And we had to swap out a couple of vendors to keep it going. But they just released the first shipment, I think, released 3 or 4 days ago. I think it's sold out. But there's another one coming in, I think, in another week. So pretty excited about that.
That's super exciting. And I'm living under a rock. I'm like, oh, they just launched flannel. Can I read your magazine every time it comes out? So I'm not sure why it's just like a disconnect.
Well,
I got really excited.
Well, if you're interested, go. There's an article, I'm sure you can find it online, called "The Annals of Flannel" in the New York Times, and you can actually, that article it kind of walks through step by step that entire year-long journey. The reporter that wrote the article basically traveled with me for a year and watched that whole effort to stand up a domestic yarn-dyed flannel capability. And it's a fun article to read because it's a good little window into American manufacturing and the areas that are still really cranking and areas that have kind of left to rust a bit.
For sure. So I have a quick question on textile and just textile dyes, because I'm just so interested in this as you know, from an ag perspective, right? We're concerned about the pesticides and the waterways, but you know, textiles and the dyes, I think, are one of the world's second largest polluters of water, and I'm sure there's stats around that globally versus the United States and other parts of the world, but what are your what's new happening in this area, and anything you're excited about, or are you
there's a lot of stuff happening there's a lot that I'm excited about. I think one thing that's just important for consumers to remember is if you buy anything that is made within the United States, you can sleep easy at night knowing that those things are produced within the construct and the legal framework of the United States. And so it's got the strictest environmental laws. Basically, you can quibble about whether there's parts of Europe that have, but they're both sort of top of the pile. They have very strong human rights laws, minimum wage laws, healthcare laws. And so you just by buying, if you buy from a local farmer, let's say, you buy from a local manufacturer that's producing in the United States, you can know well that they are addressing issues like, let's say, what you're referencing, which is dyes going into waterways, for example. That's not legal in the United States. You can't do that. You can do it, unfortunately, in places like China, where you hear stories of rivers that are running blue with indigo dye from denim manufacturers. So I think that's, and I think, I'm fascinated right now.
It's good to know. It's a reminder, right?
Yeah. It's just, people forget that. Yeah. People forget that.
Exactly.
I mean, I think that the thing that drives me a little crazy is I get asked a lot, like, are you a believer in raising the minimum wage? Are you a believer in unions? And I always say that's an incomplete question, because if what you're asking me is, should we raise the minimum wage to $18 an hour and require all of our manufacturing enterprises and agricultural enterprises and farms to pay everybody $18 an hour at the same time that we allow Nike and the Gap to go take their production to a place like Shenzhen where they're paying people pennies a garment? No, because then all you're doing is you're going to put further pressure on a source of jobs domestically. But if we're going to address both of those things, then of course I'm a believer in increasing the hourly pay for the trades and for manufacturing jobs. I think Americans forget that all these laws that are in place, environmental laws, human rights laws, safety laws, are laws that we have put in and voted into place as American citizens that we believe are right and good. I agree with those things. They're laws for a reason. And the gap is that we've allowed our policymakers to not require businesses to adhere to them. And that's a strange thing. That's a not a great thing to do to all of us as citizens, because I think the result is we basically little by little are taking away vital, vibrant jobs in places that really need them, while we're allowing big companies to get very, very wealthy, get their shareholders very, very wealthy by skirting those regulations. And I think that's an imbalance we got to address. We got to hold our politicians accountable for as well.